Again, my name is Ted Clement, Executive Director of Save Mount Diablo. We hope you are all well amidst all the dynamic turmoil that's been going on. While there are certainly more challenging times ahead, it is also certain that nature can continue to nourish, connect, and uplift us if we go into it respectfully and responsibly, and this is especially important in difficult times. We're really excited because we have a very special gift of gratitude for you, our supporters. This afternoon's Zoom presentation by Francis Mendoza and Kevin Dixon, naturalists with the East Bay Regional Parks District and certified interpretive guides. Their presentation is entitled Working with Indigenous Communities, Preserving Cultural Resources, and Managing Sensitive Sites. Mount Diablo and other nearby natural areas have been important, sacred, healing, and inspiring places for Native peoples of this area for thousands of years, and that continues to this day. I want to thank Save Mount Diablo's terrific new Land Programs Director, Sean Burke, for arranging today's Zoom presentation. Sean used to work as a ranger for East Bay Regional Park District. In these challenging times, we are working hard to uplift our communities with our usual land conservation work and additional efforts like this regular, free educational Zoom series focused on how nature heals and inspires us, and our lighting of the beacon atop Mount Diablo every Sunday night so that we can thank our heroes, come together, and collectively lift our eyes to the light in nature. Getting out and connecting meaningfully and responsibly with nature during times of crisis like the current times is especially important, as we know nature can help us heal physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Gratefully, because of your wonderful support, our Save Mount Diablo staff continue to work hard on conserving our critical Mount Diablo natural areas here. Together, we will continue to do great things to protect the ultimate foundation for our long-term health and well-being, nature. Francis and Kevin, I want to give you a big thank you for your good work and for providing this gift of inspiration and gratitude to our wonderful supporters. Please take it away. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much, Ted. And one thing that's really nice is that you're out in the field and you showed us a shot of Mount Shasta over there. So we're really, there it is, up in Northern California and Winneman-Wintu territory. But I want to thank Save Mount Diablo, Ted, Sean as well. We really miss having him here at the East Bay Regional Park District, but it's really great to have him at Save Mount Diablo, one of our lovely partners that we work with in ensuring that we have these lands for everybody. Of course, these lands, this territory originally as ancestral land for the Ohlone, the Chochenyo Ohlone specifically, and also the Bay Miwok here in the East Bay. And I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen here, if you bear with me. And it has both my contact information as well as my work in Coyote Hills Regional Park in Fremont, as well as Kevin's over at Black Diamond Mines in Antioch. So feel free to contact us, email us if you have any questions that don't get answered later on in the presentation. We're gonna talk about working with Indigenous communities and preserving cultural resources. And we also want to acknowledge this land as being that, the Chochenyo Ohlone territory, as well as Bay Miwok land. I'm gonna move to the next slide here that is all about land acknowledgement, which is basically what I did in acknowledging that this is not only their land in the past, but to the present. And this is a picture of 3 Native folks that we work with quite a bit and friends of mine. From left to right, we have Karina Gould and Greg Castro and Canyon Sayers Roods. And Canyon, I don't know if you're on the Zoom here. I know that you're not able to make today's meeting, but it will be recorded and available through Save Mount Diablo later on. She had just texted me, so. Over here on the right, we have a picture or map of one of our publications called Native Peoples of the East Bay. And you can see that there are different areas within the Bay Area. It's not, Ohlone is a modern construct word that many people are using and have been using, most popularized by a book that maybe many of you have read by Malcolm Margolin, The Ohlone Way. But in essence, you have all these different language groups in geographic areas, Chochenyo being one of them. And I'm using my cursor sort of like a pointer, so you can look at that. And then you can see that Bay Miwok is also in the East Bay as well, along with Karkeen up here, which Karina has ancestry in. And you might tie in the word Karkeen with the Carquinez Straits or Carquinez Bridge right here between present day Crockett and Rodeo and Vallejo. You also see some other names going all the way down to Gilroy and Hollister, present day Gilroy, Hollister, the Mutsun. And that's what one of the heritages that Canyon has, as well as the Rumsen down here, all the way in Monterey County. So it's a big territory stretching from Carqueen territory all the way down to Rumsen territory. I'm gonna move to the next slide and talk about how people in the current state of affairs in the country globally have been affected by not only the pandemic, but also the injustices and the murders that are happening to Black and also Indigenous folks as well. And a lot of that hasn't really been put out there into light. What the term BIPOC means is sort of a amendment to the POC or people of color designation, where Black and Indigenous people are the most marginalized of the people of color in terms of resources, travails, society that they have been going through from a very, very early time, from, of course, Indigenous folks being here on this land, but also Black Americans having come from Africa unwillingly. So again, we use that term in many circles so that we can ensure that those who are most marginalized are the topic of conversation when it comes to ensuring that they're getting environmental justice rights as well as human rights. And you might remember the Dakota Access Pipeline protests that happened a few years back, and how many of the Native folks were the ones who were fighting for not only their rights and their water and land access, as well as the health of the environment, but also our rights and our environmental health as well. Over here on the left, you'll see a graphic on a term called MMIW, or a hashtag. It's highlighting the fact that many Indigenous women especially are being murdered, and they're missing, not only in the United States, as you can see with the concentrated metropolitan areas over here in the map, but also in what we call North America, Turtle Island, including First Nations groups in Canada and also in Mexico. So it's something that we want to make sure that people know about, so that the justices that are, the injustices that are being perpetrated against Indigenous women and people of color are being addressed in law enforcement and in judicial systems, and also in social services, to ensure that these things don't continue to happen. And then most recently, you'll see a group of Native Hawaiians fighting for the protection of another sacred peak, along with Mount Shasta and Mount Diablo. You also have Mauna Kea as well in Hawaii. So these are things that should be in the conversation when we work with Indigenous peoples. And that means people here in the Bay Area, because these are realities to their relatives, to themselves, and in ensuring that we're telling the story of Native people. We're not just telling the romanticized stories of making acorn, or controlling the land in a way where fire is a way to burn it and ensure that there's a healthy environment within that land. Those are really important things to talk about, of course, but we also want to ensure that we're talking about the things that are challenges, including these topics. Now, I think Kevin has joined us here.
Can
Go
you hear
back.
me?
Hey, Kevin, we can hear you. Thanks for
Great.
finding the link. And I know it's been challenging with for many of us going on to a virtual platform. But I was just finishing up on talking about many of the challenges that Native people face. So now I'm going to go ahead and return back to our original slide. If you don't mind here. Sorry, it might be a little clunky. And here in this slide, we just wanted to just introduce ourselves a little bit more. So I'll talk first about my experience as a naturalist. Been a naturalist for about 15 years, not only at the East Bay Regional Parks, but also at the Hayward Shoreline, and also Literacy for Environmental Justice over at the Bayview Hunters Point District in San Francisco. Been an environmental educator for 25 years. And it's a fabulous job in terms of not only protecting and conserving natural and cultural resources, but also educating people about those resources, the ways of living that speak back to a time where we all had a connection with nature. And oftentimes many of us don't nowadays. And we're trying to make that reconnection for all of us. So I've been working at Coyote Hills Regional Park for the past 7 years, which is a site of a Tuibun Ohlone village. And that has been one of the main focuses in my career. So I'll throw it over to Kevin to tell you a little bit about his history.
So for me, I'm really glad to know Francis for one thing, and a lot of people in the East Bay Regional Park District. It's been a great experience in my life. And I started working for the Park District 13 years ago. And before that, I did a lot of different jobs, landscaping, construction, factory line stuff, and also different things like editing, translating, interpreting, lecturing. And this is kind of like coming back to my roots, because I spent a lot of time as a kid roaming the hills out here. And I feel like this is, those hills are truly my home. And wherever I go in the world, when I come back here, I feel like I'm home and I breathe the air of home. When I first came to the Parks District, I was a park ranger. So that's one of those people who goes out and keeps the trails safe to make sure that you can walk safely, and they maintain the facilities, they clean up the trash, and every once in a while they go out to rescue somebody when they get in trouble. And then 7 years ago, I transitioned to becoming a naturalist. And that's the kind of person who takes out groups of school children into the parks so that they can share that experience and share that wonder and that joy that some of us felt growing up. And we want them to feel comfortable and at home in their parks for years to come, because they're the ones who are going to protect them in the future. And we naturalists, and sometimes we're called interpreters, we also once in a while get to lead hikes for the general public, and we enjoy that tremendously. And for me, I'm from the East Bay. I was born and lived the first years of my life actually in the homeland of the Halkin people, in part of a place that's now called Oakland. And that's a little bit ironic because most of the Oaks are gone. There's a lot of places get named like that, right? And I just feel like I had this great privilege to grow up in these hills and valleys and places like Mount Diablo, where I was able to spend a lot of time. And the hills, the valleys, and the creatures out there have been my companions since I can remember.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to our slides here. I'm just going to forward a little bit. And we mentioned some of the parks that we work at. Here's one picture of the village site at Coyote Hills in Fremont. Many of you might have been there before, but to many, maybe you haven't been inside the village site. It's covered in a barbed wire fence. It's been that way for many decades. And it's also been a site for archaeological study by Stanford and Cal State Hayward and UC Berkeley. So it's now a site where we give tours to the public to educate them about Ohlone culture. This picture here is of a sweat house, a recreated sweat house with redwood bark. And for 2,000 years, this village has been here, about 2,400 to be exact. I'm gonna tell you about another park. Let's refrain from showing you my ugly picture there for a sec and tell you about Mission Peak. Many of us have been there as well. And in fact, it's one of our most popular parks. Upwards of 2,000 people would go there on a weekend day to run, to hike, and also to climb this Mission Peaker, we call it, that used to be a interpretive display of showing you the different features in the Bay Area, including other peaks like Mount Hamilton and Mount Umanum. And it's only at 2,517 feet. So it's really short compared to other peaks. But it's iconic in that people go there. It's part of the city of Fremont's logo. And as many of us know, the city of Fremont, where Coyote Hills and Mission Peak are both located, is named after John C. Fremont. But many of us don't know that he's a general in the Army, and back in the 1850s and 60s that had a genocide in California. He was integral in killing many Native Californians, especially in the area where Ted and Sean are right now over in Mount Shasta. So it's one of those things where there's really a history of people who have formed this nation, but this is also a nation formed out of blood and out of massacres. And that genocide is highlighted in a book that recently came out the past 3 years, I think, called An American Genocide by Benjamin Madley. At the end of the presentation, we're gonna have a resource list for you all to look at. And that's one of the books that's in it. I'm gonna go ahead and tell you about this ABC 7 News interview I did a few months back where I talked about the Native people, but of course in the editing of that video, it was not mentioned. Just speaks to the erasure that Native people have had to endure over time, basically, and how even in terms of something as subtle or innocuous as that will add on to that kind of erasure over years. So I want to advocate that whenever we're on Native land, we want to acknowledge the people that have lived there since the beginning of time. So the next park is one that Kevin will talk about.
Mm-hmm. So we're looking at a couple of pictures of Vasco Caves Regional Preserve, and the one on the left is a view through a sheep gate out toward a mountain that a lot of you recognize. There's some North Peak on the right and Mount Diablo on the left. So Native people, we know a lot of the Native names for these mountains around here and a lot of the places, and these are names that are still used, for example, by the Chochenyo people today. For example, Tuishtak for Mount Diablo. When I started working at Black Diamond Mines, it was 2013. And after a little while, I found out that I was expected to lead these tours of a place called Vasco Caves, just north of the Livermore Valley. And the caves, you might know, are named for the Basque people who settled in that area in the 19th century. And most of you also know that this place has really limited public access. And unlike almost all of our parks and our lakes and our picnic areas, you can't just drive in there or walk in there. There's a big unmarked gate out on Vasco Road. The only way to get in is with a Park District naturalist. And even then you have to stay with your group the whole 4 hours that you're there. And you're not allowed to take pictures with your cell phone, and you're even encouraged to turn your cell phone off. And for a lot of you who are familiar with a freedom in the parks, this might seem like a big burden, especially when you consider that the caves are not really proper caves. You know, you don't need any special breathing apparatus. You're not going to see stalagmites or stalactites, no unexpected chambers, maybe not even any bats. So what they really are is they're more like hollows in the sandstone rocks, and the locals call them wind caves. And to top it all off, the weather out there tends to be really challenging. Both Francis and I have led tours out there in really driving, frigid winter rain. And at other times, as the season progresses, it can be completely dried out there and hot winds are whipping through. So all of those things really do make leading a tour of Vasco Caves challenging. But I think for me, it wasn't really those physical aspects or organizational aspects that made it hard. What was hard for me and what made me hesitate at first to go out there and lead tours was this responsibility of sharing someone else's culture. And it's even harder because Vasco Caves isn't just the homeland of another people. It's their sacred place. It's their temple. It's a place where they go to restore balance to the world and the place to connect with ancestors. And so I felt like I had to be really careful and do a lot of work before I could go out to Vasco and take other people there.
The Vasco tours that we do are we're charged with not only protecting the resources there, but also the Native people who have that connection to this day. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the resources there that are not only cultural, but also natural as well. We want to put this in the framework of how the Save Mount Diablo series of webinars have been going, in that nature heals and inspires. And I think when I go out to Vasco, it's definitely a healing and inspiring place for me, let alone the participants of the programs. So now we're gonna talk about what we're gonna do for the rest of the presentation, interpreting Native culture. And when we talk about interpretation, we're not talking about language interpretation, even though that is something that many Native folks, including folks in the Mutsun tribe, there's a Mutsun language trust, as well as Chochenyo language revitalization by many of our friends. But instead, we're talking about the interpretation of programs, cultural and Native heritage interpretation. That is a profession that many park rangers, naturalists, folks who work in zoos and museums, to ensure that we're doing it in a culturally appropriate way, and also a provocative way as well, to inspire folks. So we'll talk about that, along with preserving cultural resources, such as the site management at Vasco, other places in the East Bay Regional Parks, where oftentimes we don't tell folks that there are resources there, so that it doesn't go the way of somebody's cigar box, like arrowheads have done over the past 100 or so years. We're also going to talk about best practices on how to work with Native folks. I have a lot of Native friends that I just hang out with. They're just really cool people. And I think that that's one of the practices that I can sort of put out there for all of us to go to these different events all over the Bay Area, all over Native California, such as big times and gatherings. Oftentimes they're called powwows in other parts of Turtle Island. But that's how I've been able to form a network of really good friends, mentors, and people that work in a really good way. So one group of Native folks is a family that some of us might be familiar with, the matriarchs especially. Here in the picture on the left, you'll see a frame, picture frame of an ancestor. Her name is Trina, Maureen Ruano. She's the mother of Ruth Orta, who's holding the picture. And Ruth is 85 years old as our park district. Actually, she might be 86 actually. Yeah, because our park district just turned 86, or she will be turning 86 in August. But you can see here that she has 5 generations of Ohlone women. You see her daughter Mona, and her daughter Rita, and then her daughter Athena. And on the picture on the right, they're cracking acorns. So the family has worked with Coyote Hills for many, many years, specifically with another person you might know, Dr. Beverly Ortiz, who started the Ohlone intern program way back when, right around the time of the first gathering of Ohlones 26 years ago. And to this day, we have a Ohlone program where Native people are the ones who are talking to the public, to young folks, to school children about their culture. So we're continuing that here, and they wanted us to know that we are still here, like the tagline says. And I'm just going to read a quote from Ruth. We want them to know that we're still here. 5 generations of people connected to the original people. And that is from a curriculum called the Abalone Curriculum, written by Bev Ortiz. And I'm going to show you now a plant, or a resource from a plant that many of us might know about, or many of us might have even made it before. This is soaproot. And soaproot comes from under the ground. It's also called soap plant. And they make a brush out of this. And the brush itself has string, maybe from dogbane, another plant that's wrapped around 2 different bundles. The fibers are enveloping the root underneath. And then the handle is made from the juice that comes from the tuber inside. It's like a little onion or garlic. And here's Mona from the family in the slide before, gathering soaproot at a hillside in Coyote Hills. It's not the easiest thing. If anyone's ever been to Coyote Hills, the ground here is rough. It's tough. You can sort of see the rocky outcropping here made from chert. And to dig into that ground, either with a shovel or a traditional digging stick, is very tough. So you want to come out here in the right season when the ground is softer. And Mona's doing that not only as a way to make these brushes, but also to interpret to other people how it's done. Here is a front cover of the Abalone Curriculum, and you can see that it has alignment with standards for the state of California. And the picture you had seen before of Greg Castro is actually working to help have a California Indian history curriculum through a coalition, and ensuring that this is one of the examples locally of Abalone curriculum, along with Bay Miwok and Delta Yokut content, but also having that be a part of all Californians' curriculum, to have Native California practices and narratives and examples of people today within their regular school curriculum. Now, I'm going to just put some examples of some alignment with other standards, not only social science standards, but also next generation science standards. That's what NGSS stands for. And we also have a blueprint for environmental literacy in California that's now something that every Californian will be literate in, as well as these cross-cutting concepts with the NGSS standards that not only focus on the social science part of the curriculum, but also marries it with not only science, obviously through many of the scientific techniques that Native people have been doing in their everyday living, but also the math and the music and all the things that they do through song and ceremony that will be in these curriculums, hopefully, with the advent of the coalition. And then here's my dream Venn diagram. I know that many of us know what a Venn diagram is, and you can see here on the left, natural resources being one aspect of it. And soaproot, here's how it looks like on top of the ground, long green wavy leaves. And that's, of course, a natural resource that Native people would use digging sticks to dig for. It's a cultural resource to have soap root brushes, but also to have it as soap. Obviously, the name soap root indicates its namesake as a soap. The juice that's on the handle before it hardens can be a soap, can also be a food when it's young and cooked in underground ovens, a fish stunner as well. So there's historical documents of Native people bringing 50 of them out to the creek, putting them in the water in the form of a juice, and then having the fish get stunned by them, actually affect their physiology to the point where they're easier to catch with nets and baskets. So it's a wonderful cultural resource, along with what an interpreter in the profession of interpretation looks to is connecting everything with values, common values and intangibles, things that we all need, not just the Native folks, but people today, including modern Native folks. Here is a little quote that wrote out for you. I'll just read it out. Ohlonies enhanced the diversity of resources that were so key to their thriving communities. Today, citizens can learn from these original stewards to maintain healthy habitats. So it's a great way of showing that, not necessarily were the Ohlonies the first environmentalists or the ones who take care of the land. We all do. And this is a way for us to learn about it in a way that's sustainable and also giving back to the land and not just taking from the land. Now, I jumped a little bit over there and showed a nice picture of Kevin, but I'm going to talk here.
So when we get to Vasco Caves, usually we stop the bus at the top of the hill and we look over the valley and the other hills that we're going to before we go any farther. And in this place, I usually talk not just about the landscape and how beautiful things are, but also the plants and animals within it. So the grasses and the other plants that we see all over the hills are mostly these newcomer plants from Europe and the Mediterranean. So I invite the visitors to look around and see if they can find some green bunch grasses like the ones I'm sitting in there. And these are long-lived grasses that are native to California with very deep roots. And I invite people to imagine a landscape with far more flowers and far more sources of food and medicine than they see now. So you might imagine a landscape in March and April that looks like a colorful mosaic or a Persian carpet in comparison to what you see now with the green hills. So a little bit different. And this is a land with those foods from the grasses and with the underground foods, like Francis mentioned one of them, but there were many more. And there are other plants out there that can sustain a whole people just from that land right there. And you might also want to imagine elk and antelope on the hills and badgers and bears, things that you don't see these days. So I treat the experience of visiting this unique place as an opportunity for reflection. So the landscapes and the relationships to the land are always cultural. So we can think about what do the wind turbines and the sheep grazing that's going on out there, or the agriculture that you can see from there, the industrial agriculture in the Central Valley, what do they say about the culture, the overwhelming culture of California now? And what do the activities of the biologists who come out there and the anthropologists who come out there to look, what do they tell us? So can we imagine a different way of seeing and a different way of being on the land? Can we think about the story of this land? And can we think about how Native people tended it for countless generations and how they cared for it and how it gave them what they needed? And there we go. So I started to work in the beginning when I started leading the Vasco Caves tours to find out what I could about California history and California Indians. So I looked into the work of anthropologists and archaeologists, and I read about what really happened during the time of Spanish occupation, which is what we often call the mission period. And I learned about the closing of the missions and how many of the Indian people moved out to work on ranches in the area, how they could not return to their homelands and their sacred places because they were claimed by the newcomers, and how many of the foods they depended on couldn't be found any longer. So we Californians, and I'm generalizing, of course, but this reflects my education, we've been taught to celebrate the gold rush. We've been taught to celebrate the pioneers. And we're taught that these pioneers were the first people to really value California's resources and put them to use. We're not taught about the decades of murder, the rape, the kidnapping, the torture, the enslavement, and the humiliation of Indian people that followed this new migration. We're not taught about the generations of Indian people who kept their culture alive against all odds and maintain their communities today. And I don't talk about all of this when we go out to Vasco Caves, but this is some of the history that I needed to learn to get comfortable enough to start going out there. And I was thinking about what is the role of the East Bay parks in engaging Native history and culture on these lands that we maintain for the people of the East Bay. So I feel like we are here to gently open a window onto Indian culture for some of our neighbors. We're here to give them an opportunity to engage with Indian people who still live in the East Bay, still live in their homelands. We're not here to define Native culture for them. We're not here to arrange Native culture in a museum collection or make a spectacle of it. We're not here to critique Indian cultures, and we're not here to glorify them, but we can acknowledge what has come before and show respect for what is still here. Many of us have seen what happens to Native sites when they're not protected, and it can be devastating. So, except in special circumstances like the tours that Francis does at Coyote Hills, we don't lead hikes to ancestral village sites. In a few special places like Vasco Caves and Brooks Island, we try to balance respect and access by limiting tours to private groups accompanied by a naturalist.
Those are my favorite tours to lead. I think am I muted? Oh, I am on there. I thought I was muted. So yeah, like Kevin mentioned, Vasco Caves, one of my favorite tours to lead. And when the shelter in place started happening, I was really bummed out to have many of those tours canceled. You know, we're trying our best to do some kind of social distancing plan. Brooks Island is another one that I really love doing. It's an island off of the city of Richmond that is also a special place for Native folks as well. Lots of different types of native plants and butterflies and lichen. So it's a great place that just shows you the biodiversity that's out here on native land. Here's, you just saw some pictures of us giving tours. And now we're gonna look at some of the resources we've been using to inform us, including one called From Rancho to Reservoir, put out by the Contra Costa Water District a few decades back. And this is available online. You can even see that I screenshotted them on my phone. So just look up Rancho to Reservoir. You can see that there is a picture here of Bay Miwok and Ohlone people at Mission San Jose dancing, doing a ceremonial dance. But that's not often the case that they were allowed to do ceremony. In fact, they were really punished if they did, just if they spoke their language. Lots of, and Kevin spoke to this earlier about the torture and the rape and the killings that have happened. Not only that, but also the pandemic that they've gone through, not being able to have defenses against European diseases. So this is definitely not the first pandemic that Native people have gone through. And then we have here a enhanced picture in black and white of one of the panels of rock art that we're able to show. And again, Kevin mentioned that we don't allow people to take pictures by cell phone because it will geotag these areas and encourage folks to come back there on their own. We have caretakers at both those places to ensure that there's security in the places and people are not going there. And we also have our police, our public safety that ensures that as well. So if you've never been on a Vasco Caves tour, I encourage you to go. You can see this rock art here and you can do your own interpretation of it, especially seeing it in person. There's a little bit of a blow up of it here. You can see the overlay of graffiti that has happened as well, including Gary. Over on the right, you have a mortar, and mortars are really important to Native folks, not just in the past, but to this day. So we don't want people to go looking for these mortars, and we want them to not come in contact with them, touch them and feel them, because these are places that are sacred and we want to respect that. Blow up of the picture of the Ohlone and Miwok dancers. And we're talking about culture past, present, and future. Well, we have folks in the present, like the Amakatura dance group that comes out to the gathering at Coyote Hills. And we had our 26th annual gathering last year. And we have also the Humaya dancers from the Costanoan and Rumsen Carmel tribe that comes here too. So this is really great to have this revitalization of culture, but it's not the only thing that Native people are. It's not just buckskin and feathers. It's also folks today who live modern lives just like we do, but have their intimate connection with their ancestors. And you can see young Ohlone folks here cutting tule over at Coyote Hills, and they're building a boat. One of the wonderful projects that I've been a part of over the past 7 years here at Coyote Hills is this Ohlone Youth Summit, where 3 different tribes came together and built a boat and put it out in the water during the gathering. Now we're going to talk about best practices. And this is one best practice that we've been looking at all throughout this slide presentation of the background of these 2 young folks in a tule boat. Those are Ohlones. And those are folks who wanted to recreate a very famous lithograph from 1816 done by Louis Choris. And you can see that a lot of the knowledge that we have is from historical records, from the colonizers to the missions to folks who in the early 1900s, anthropologists like Alfred Kroeber, who effectively declared Ohlone being extinct. Also, J.P. Harrington, an ethnographer who went around and recorded lots of the language, and also the ethnobotany in Mutsun and Rumsen territory as well. So we rely on these as resources for how Native folks have lived here since time immemorial. But look at Sam and Desiree, they're cousins. Desiree used to be a park ranger over to Presidio. Sam used to be an intern with Golden Gate National Recreation Area. You can see the Golden Gate Bridge in the background of this picture here. So it's not only putting Native people in the light of their past, their ancestors, but also putting them in their modern context as well, and ensuring that that is, and as you might have seen from the presentation, we didn't start with the buckskin and feathers. We started with the Native people wearing clothes in a modern way. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and just talk about each of these best practices that we've come to learn over many, many years, not just with me and other naturalists like Sonia Gomez, but all the way back to the inception of the park 50 years ago with naturalists like Norm Kidder and Jan Southworth. We want to portray Native people as they are now. We talked a little bit about that, with that intimate connection to their ancestors. protect and preserve cultural resources, which Kevin had talked about with Vasco and other sites like here at Coyote Hills with the village site, through site management and interpretation. I talked a little bit about not just the buckskin and feathers, to dispel Native stereotypes through education. You don't know how many times we'll have kids come over here hooping and hollering like they've seen in lots of movies. And also folks who are wearing sports teams of mascots that are Native, like the Washington Redskins. And whenever Halloween comes around, I always make it a point to tell folks that we don't want to wear a costume that's another person's culture. We also compensate Indigenous people for their time, their travel, and our occupation on their land, but also their love for their culture and their community. And that's something that's really important. So that's something that the Park District has been, I mean, of course, we're a public agency, so a lot of times the fees are nominal, but we want to try to ensure that that is happening on for each and every program that they contribute to us. Be mindful of narratives and cultural practices. A lot of them are things that we don't want to either record or we want to ask permission to be able to say a story that somebody had written or translated, and conduct consultation through protocol. And these are things that we do in terms of not just out of respect, but it's something that is really important to the people who work with Native folks. That it's happening between tribes, so it should happen as we're in essence a tribal entity ourselves. And then do not culturally appropriate. Talked a little bit about that. Instead, seek to bridge common humanity. So the songs, the prayers, those are things that the Native folks have been doing for forever. And that's something that they should be doing into the future. And we want to save the education for many non-Natives who are really invested in this mission to interpret Native culture appropriately. Lastly, honor elders and ancestors. The way that you live in a good way. When we have meetings, when we have a consultation about a certain action that's happening in one of our parks, we also want to share food. Make sure the elders have food first and they get sent food home. And these are things that are just a way of not just working, but having a fostered relationship through time with our Native friends. Kevin, did you want to add anything on to this?
No, not here. No, maybe we'll just go on to the resources and then hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions. Does that sound good?
That was great. So, Kevin, why don't you take it away with this resource list?
Okay, so it looks like I'm muted.
No, I can hear you.
Okay, all right, sorry. So here we go. These are some of the books, just a few of the books that Francis and I have found useful. And I think if you're not already familiar with these books, and once you take a look through them, you'll get interested in other aspects of Native California. And there's a lot more resources out there. But Francis already mentioned the Ohlone Curriculum. Dr. Beverly Ortiz put that together. She's just recently retired. Francis, you want to mention Bad Indians?
Yeah, Bad Indians is one of my favorite books, just came out maybe 8 years ago. And it's by Professor Deborah Miranda, who is Ohlone and Esalen. And it's just a culmination of prose, poetry, art that speaks to her family's history, but also the intergenerational trauma that many Native people feel throughout their history, not just the trauma that they themselves feel, but the trauma that their ancestors have felt as well.
Yeah, and American genocide, Francis already mentioned that, but it kind of spells out what really happened in that post-gold rush period when this land was claimed by the United States. I really appreciate, because I love plants, and I really appreciate tending the wild because it lets me get to know some of the plants that I love even closer, and talks about ways of being on the land and caring for the land. So I really recommend that. I think we'll just leave it at that maybe, and then go to questions. What do you think, Francis?
Yeah, absolutely.
The one was, is there a specific Ohlone reservation or rancheria in the Bay Area currently?
There is not a reservation. As many folks know, the Ohlone are not federally recognized, which oftentimes comes with, some giving of some type of land, whether it's close to their ancestral homeland or far away. Mm-hmm. There has been a diaspora of Native folks from Ohlone territory. For example, one of the tribes I mentioned over in Monterey, the Costanoan Rumsen Carmel tribe, many of their members moved to Southern California. Mm-hmm. Whether it's Monterey has really high costs of living, and also high home prices and land. So there is a long history of that, of not just that tribe, but many different tribes and individuals moving to places where they can afford. The rancherias, there's one over in, I think I might have mentioned this before, Sunol, Pleasanton, present-day Sunol and Pleasanton, that's called the Alisal Rancheria. And that's where Native folks, Yokut folks, Ohlone, Miwok, they all came together there to try to conduct and continue their ceremonial practices, oftentimes an amalgamation of many different tribes. And then many of us might know of the Great Rancheria over in Marin and Sonoma County, that's comprised of coastal Miwok and southern Pomo folks as well. And they're going to reopen their casino pretty soon, what I heard. I know a lot of my friends are excited for that to happen.
Thank you. Then we have a question for Kevin. What kind of work did you do before you led tours to honor and respect Indigenous people?
Okay, so I think I mentioned before that I was a park ranger, and then before that I taught Indonesian language and Southeast Asian studies at University of Victoria in British Columbia. Mm-hmm. And I've also done some interpreting and translating, but a whole lot of different jobs. But that was one of them. Yeah.
We have an artist who loves to paint on location, and he's wondering if instead of a full tour, if it's possible to go to a specific spot and paint on location for a few hours. I'm thinking maybe he's thinking of the Black Diamond Mines tour.
Well, clearly for all of the parks except for the ones that that we mentioned in Brooks Island and Vasco Caves, and I know there are a lot of people who would like to set up at Vasco Caves and paint. Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, and I'm not in a position of authority, no one has been given permission to lead a tour specifically for art yet. I think it's a great idea, and I don't see why it couldn't happen in the future.
Great, great. Here's another one. As park visitors, conservationists, birders, artists, naturalists, what can we do to support our Indigenous community and protect their land and natural resources? I did see that you did, include some of that towards the end of your presentation. This question was asked before that. Is there anything that that maybe wasn't covered?
I'll let Francis go.
Thanks, Kevin. There's a land tax called the Shumi land tax, instituted by Corina Gould, who was one of the land acknowledgement workshop presenter panelists earlier, and that's something you can contribute to on an annual basis. She also has co-founded the Segurate Land Trust, all women-led land trust, trying to get land back to the Ohlone people and Native folks here in the Bay Area. And then just being a part of these conversations in your city council, in your city hall, in your school board meetings. For example, the Muwekma Ohlone tribe recently had a major victory in forcing South Bay City to rename a school from Peter Burnett Middle School to Ohlone Middle School. very telling in that it's not only some landowner's name. Peter Burnett's the name of the first governor of California who predicted a extermination of Native people in California. So those kind of things, just being in the know about them and also supporting them is really important.
That's great. Is there a course of study we can take in the California Environmental Literacy Initiative?
You know, that is something that has been put out by the state of California first as a blueprint, and now something that we can all follow. It's, you know, taking some time and traction for it to be inculcated into the school-wide curriculum, but hopefully that is something that will continue to grow. In terms of lifelong learning, there's California Naturalists is a great certification that you can receive, and they do a lot of indigenous interpretation. They also have some tribes in the southern part of California that are actually doing their California Naturalist certification as well. And then Merritt College has a program, as well as WVC in Saratoga, West Valley College.
Okay, great. Do the indigenous people lead tours as well?
Oh, that's a great question. Not to the extent that we'd like them to, not because that they don't want to, but because they have lives like we do, and not just one job, multiple jobs. So we try to give them as much as they want in terms of their wanting to share with their culture and with others.
Here's a couple more. We actually have several, so I'll get through as many as we can, and then I can even follow up. I have the chat text, and we can follow up after to maybe address some of these other questions. Somebody was mentioning I would really like if East Bay Parks could do a massive program to bring natives into the organization in a major way, particularly because America has taken away opportunities from the original people. Is there any way to really push change, particularly during this time of anti-racist movement? Are there any projects to give people back looted land to the natives in a big way? And there are other people also asking about, you know, similar questions.
Kevin, do you want to take this, or shall I?
You go ahead, Francis.
Talked about the Shumi land tax, Segurite land trust as well. And, you know, those are really important movements that have been happening through Corrina Gould. And it's really important that we continue those and even step up the game, so to speak, because that history is there. It's just, I think the first step of doing so is exposing that history to many people who don't know about it. And secondly, setting up the system in place where there can be things done about it. Many of us know this is the racism that many of us have been feeling as BiPOC is systemic. So going into those systems and making radical change is really important. I don't have the answer to that, to tell you the truth, but hopefully a multifaceted approach where all these different things are, from education to giving back land to giving reparations or recognition, are a culmination of those solutions will be the answer to it.
Okay. Francis, to your knowledge, do you know if Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge has any indigenous architectural sites?
Yeah, two different sites in Don Edwards, close to Fremont here, or in Fremont actually, is the Environmental Education Center over there. I know that they have or had a Ruwe or a Tule house over there, and Alviso as well. But I'm not sure to what extent their cultural resources are over there as opposed to ours. And we've done partnerships with them, but they've done a lot more of the birding and natural history and salt pond interpretation, and we've done a lot more of the native interpretation.
Okay, great. And we really, really appreciate your time today. This is so timely and so meaningful to us. And we appreciate your support of Save Mount Diablo. We've had a long very positive connection with East Bay Regional Parks, and can't thank you enough.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. It was
Thank you.
great to contact you, even in this remote way.
Yes.
Thank you.
Contact information down there. Feel free to contact us as well.
Excellent.
Everybody,
Thank you. You've been wonderful.